This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good afternoon, and we're coming on the air at this hour with new developments involving Russia and Ukraine. We have been monitoring Vladimir Putin speaking to the Russian people, and just moments ago, Putin addressing the Russian people, saying he reveals that he intends to recognize two Russian-controlled separatist regions in eastern Ukraine to recognize their independence. That was expected. It was a move leaders in the West had been most concerned about that could possibly spark a much larger conflict. Putin, just before his remarks to the Russian people, had already informed France and Germany of his decision. Doing so would be, in fact, a major escalation, and now he has done that, likely forcing the U.S. and allies to impose severe sanctions they said would be coming if Russia moved to recognize their independence. Putin saying moments ago, I deem it necessary to immediately recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. These are two regions of the Donbass region where Russian separatists have been living. They have been in conflict with Ukraine for some time. Vladimir Putin saying he will now recognize them as independent, drafting a document and signing it, he said, almost immediately. He did tell the Russian people that he then expected sanctions from the West almost immediately, saying they will likely come. This move is a violation of international law. The Russian military could now react by moving in those 150,000 troops that have been surrounding Ukraine. President Putin could use this as a pretext to then help the Russian separatists, again, within this region, the Donbass region there in eastern Ukraine, that he's now said he will declare as independent. Two separate areas within the Donbass region, he says, are and will be independent. We do know that, again, tens of thousands of Russian troops amassed on that border. The question now is whether or not Vladimir Putin will send any of those troops in to help secure this independence. He had a warning for Ukraine to end hostilities, and as the West had said he would likely do, he began to describe the situation in Ukraine the other way around, saying essentially that the hostilities are caused by the Ukrainians, that there are women, children, and elderly suffering at the hands of the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine there, where Russian separatists, of course, have been living and controlling their own regions for some time, though not acknowledged by the Russians as independent. I want to bring in our senior foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, and I know this can be somewhat confusing for people who've been watching this conflict, watching the West predict and prepare the world for what they believe could be coming. But, Ian, this was precisely what the Biden administration was most concerned about, that he would recognize two key parts of the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine as independent now from Ukraine.
Yeah, David, I think this is the most dangerous moment in this crisis, and there are still many questions unanswered. Are we actually just seeing the end of the beginning of this crisis? In other words, has Vladimir Putin just laid out a smaller ambition just to officially recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, these two tiny, small areas in the far east of Ukraine that are part of the bigger Donbass industrial region? The rebels, the Russian-supported, Kremlin-backed rebels, essentially control 30% of the Donbass, and the Ukrainian government controls 70%. Now, what follows on from this recognition of independence? Is it just that Russia will support them in their own governance, that things will calm down? I think the greater fear here, the very real fear, is that is not what Vladimir Putin said today. We were treated to this long, rambling, revisionist history of the history of Ukraine, essentially saying that it was a Soviet creation. But I think innate in all of that was this underlying thought by Vladimir Putin, which we've heard expressed before. He doesn't really recognize Ukraine as a sovereign, independent, strong country that should be treated as such. He sees it as an artificial creation and that it's harming Russia's interests. So if this declaration, if this recognition of independence then leads to greater military action, to the rolling in of Russian tanks, to an extension of the territory, then I think the larger fears of the Biden administration are really going to come to pass. If all that happens is you have this legislative process where you say, yes, we recognize your independence, but nothing else follows, which I don't think is going to happen, then perhaps we can breathe a little. But I don't think that's what we're looking at. I think we're looking at the start of a much more serious collision of events.
Ian, you talked about Vladimir Putin in addressing the Russian people, not holding anything back there. In fact, he talked about Ukraine wanting to become potentially a nuclear power again, saying they would want a nuclear weapon. He suggested that the West would help them with that. He talked about NATO growing, that was not a promise kept by the West over many, many years along the Russian border there. And Ian, I want to drill down on this point, though. The main question at this point is not whether or not Vladimir Putin is going to officially acknowledge what he says is the independence of these two distinct areas of the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. The question is whether or not he then believes it will be necessary to send in Russian military to help secure that independence.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is a question that I think we've all got to be really focused on. What does it lead to? Do you then see the leaders of these two little statelets, if you like, then appeal to Russia, who's recognized its independence, and say, look, we're under attack by the Ukrainians? And that's the narrative that they've been portraying over the last 4 or 5 days, that we're under sustained attack, that they're committing genocide. They've used this word genocide against the Russian-speaking population there, that women, children and the elderly have to flee the country. We've seen a series of these bogus so-called false flag operations to justify the building up of armaments and support in the area. If they then appeal to Russia and Russia responds militarily, the question is, what does the Ukrainian military do? Does it just stand by and allow Russia to take over part of its territory? Does it stand and fight? And if it does, then that's when we're really in dangerous territory, because you have all those other Russian troops massed to the north in Belarus, to the south in Crimea. If they start to roll across the border, then the worst case scenario, which is what the Biden administration has been telling us all will happen, will come to pass. And all of this is centered on what was Vladimir Putin really asking for here? Did he just want these security guarantees that Ukraine was never going to join NATO? Or was this really about restoring the might of Russia, restoring the Russian Empire, not recognizing Ukraine as a valid country? And I'm afraid a lot of what we heard in this rambling speech tonight echoes those kinds of fears. And if that is the case, then I'm afraid we're entering a dark period.
And we should point out, Ian Panel, thank you for outlining what we could be witnessing here along the Ukraine-Russian border, could be witnessing. Of course, we don't know the next move from Vladimir Putin, other than the fact that he has just declared before the Russian people that he will declare much of the Donbass region, those two regions in particular that are included, as independent from Ukraine. He said, if we then have to act, I am sure the Russian people will support the efforts. I want to go to our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, because the Biden administration, Cecilia, has been very clear on this. I know we're awaiting word whether or not they will impose severe sanctions immediately, whether they're going to continue to observe what happens next. In the meantime, you and I were talking before we came on the air that the State Department outlined this very scenario in recent days and what this would constitute if this was, in fact, the action that Vladimir Putin takes.
Yeah, and David, this is really important because European allies had explicitly warned Vladimir Putin to not go through with exactly what he is announcing that he is going to go through with right now. And the State Department, the administration, the Biden administration, did as well just a number of days ago. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had said that this would be a gross violation of international law. He said it would necessitate a swift and firm response from the United States in full coordination with all of our allies and partners. So while the ball is in Vladimir Putin's court for what happens next in terms of whether he decides to go for what Ian was just saying, a full-scale invasion, as the United States and the White House here have been predicting right now in these next immediate minutes, if not hours, the ball is in the court of Western allies and the White House to see how far they go with this package of sanctions. They have been deliberately vague leading up to this and not telling us what sanctions would entail, just that you have heard President Biden use this phrase, swift and severe sanctions. We know that it will be a massive package of sanctions. We know that the vice president over the weekend, when she was at that security conference in Munich, said that these would be some of the greatest sanctions, if not the strongest, that we have ever issued. And we also know, David, that allies, Western allies, are united on this front, that they are all threatening swift and severe sanctions. I think the question right now in terms of what these sanctions will look like is whether the administration and the allies decide to sort of scale this back just based on what Putin announced today, UK. They had threatened these sanctions based on a full-scale invasion that they had been warning of. But in terms of what these sanctions potentially could look like, we're talking about Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, just said the other day that we could be talking about preventing Russian companies from trading in British pounds and American dollars if Putin decides to invade. We're looking at everything from blocking Russia's access to technology, electronic supplies, things like cell phone parts, which would be a huge blow to the Russian people, cutting Russia off from the international banking system, even potentially targeting Vladimir Putin himself. So as we wait to see when and if the United States decides to go forward with these sanctions and what that looked like, David, I'll just give you a quick update because this really has been an extraordinary last few days here at this White House with this change in tone. The president was supposed to be in Delaware last night, and today he canceled that trip. He just not long ago here at the White House, he's inside right now behind me, wrapped up a meeting with some of the highest levels of this administration, his vice president. This was the National Security Council meeting. The Secretary of State was here. As I said, the vice president, Secretary of Defense. And you know this, David, you talked about this big question of whether President Biden and Vladimir Putin will sit down with a face-to-face meeting, as had been floated after French President Macron's call with Putin yesterday. The White House announcing that perhaps there could be this meeting. But I will tell you, I'm being told by sources that this is a theoretical meeting, David, that it would only happen if an invasion does not take place. And right now, all the sources that I am talking to here at the White House still firmly believe that we are in this window for an invasion. And certainly what we just heard from Vladimir Putin right now, David, ratchets up this tension. There has been these incremental steps toward glimmers of hope in diplomacy, but you heard Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, say today an ominous warning that hour by hour, the hope for diplomacy is diminishing, given the behavior that we are seeing from Russia right now, David.
And you have to wonder if Vladimir Putin's announcement just moments ago before the Russian people that he will declare those two regions, the Donetsk region and the Luhansk region, both within the Donbass, as fully independent, whether or not that's a walking up to the line or has he crossed the line? The question is, will the sanctions kick in now, as Cecilia so definitely pointed out there, or whether or not they will continue to wait? There you see Vladimir Putin signing what we gather is, the documentation that backs up what he's now declared before the Russian people. In doing so, he warned the Ukrainians that hostilities must end in the Donbass region, or he warned that perhaps Russia would then have to take steps. He also said that if we do, I gather I will have the full support of the Russian people. You heard Cecilia mention the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson. He, in fact, held a press conference at Downing Street as this was unfolding just moments ago. He said this move by Vladimir Putin is plainly in breach of international law, flagrant violation of the sovereignty, the integrity of Ukraine. He took it a step further even. He said, I think it's a very ill omen and a very dark sign that things are headed in the wrong direction. Our foreign correspondent, James Longman, is in Moscow. He, of course, was monitoring what Vladimir Putin was telling the Russian people. And, James, you've also been watching what we've been reporting here, which have been the images that the Russian people have been watching now for several days now. The West, the U.S. in particular, had warned of a false flag operation, or several of them, to build this narrative that the eastern portion of Ukraine had become very dangerous for these Russian separatists. It brought told thousands that they should evacuate and come into Russia. And now he has told the Russian people that Ukraine wants a nuclear weapon, that the West is helping them, that they did not keep their promises over many, many years as far as NATO expansion was concerned. This was Vladimir Putin basically telling the Russian people all of the things that he thinks the West has not kept their promises on. And the question now is whether or not this is the beginning, as Ian pointed out, of something much larger here.
Yeah, I think we really did see Putin unchained. And I think it's really important for people at home to realize that the way that this crisis has been packaged for Russians is the polar opposite of how all of us around the rest of the world understand it, which is that Ukraine is the aggressor. There is potentially genocide. He used the word there. He's used it time and time again, going on against Russian speakers in these separatist areas. There have been mass graves uncovered, war crimes committed. And the United States, together with its Western allies, has been, and he said it there, pumping weapons along with NATO into Ukraine. And so that is what Russians, a lot of them anyway, will understand of what is happening here. And so what we heard there from Vladimir Putin was this worldview that he draws his legitimacy from the past. This is the idea that he will rebuild the former Soviet Union, and he has people who are willing to listen to that message. We had a lot of these kind of ethno-religious, nationalist messages, the sentiment that the Orthodox Church was undermined. Kiev is preparing to act against the Orthodox Church, and like you said there, preparing to create nuclear weapons. I mean, it is known that Ukraine was a place where a lot of weapons ended up at the end of the Cold War. So he plays on these kind of thoughts and ideas or understandings that Russian people have, and then builds on them time and time again. I do think, though, that what's going to be really interesting to see, and you just said there about Boris Johnson swiftly condemning what he's heard, and we're likely to see this package of sanctions. It'd be really interesting to see just what the sanctions are, because let's perhaps look at maybe the possibility that for Vladimir Putin, was this the best, worst option for him? He didn't expect, perhaps, the West to show such a united front against him this time round. Remember, looking 2008, back to the war with Georgia, where it's the same playbook, announce that an area is independent and try to rebuild the Soviet Union. The Ukraine war last time round, the annexation of Crimea. Maybe he's trying to get out of it this time. Who knows?
Yeah, we certainly do not know. And as you pointed out there, James, the narrative that he has built over the last several days in Russia is precisely the same narrative that the West feared he would actually try to build and then express through the images that they've seen on Russian television and in the story that he told the Russian people there tonight. He talked about the same old words from the West. Nothing has changed in their position, that they have blackmailed us through sanctions and that they will likely sanction us again. The main question at this point, again, after declaring those two Russian-speaking, Russian separatist regions in the Donbass as independent, signing the document there moments ago, what appeared to be the document confirming what he told the Russian people. The question now is, does anything follow this as far as military steps, military intervention with some 150,000 plus Russian troops amassed all along the Ukrainian border, particularly in that region? We've shown you the troops at the north, the south, and along the eastern front, which certainly borders the Donbass. I want to bring in our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, who anchored this week from Ukraine over the weekend. And Martha, I know your sources in the U.S. military have been telling you all along you do not amass troops along the border this size, this scope, with military hospitals, clinics for blood, if you don't have a plan to follow suit with some sort of strategy here that would involve them.
And that starts with the Secretary of Defense on down. They do believe an invasion is coming. I don't think this speech changes it. It probably escalates it. David, you keep referring to telling the Russian people. We have to remember what he did tonight was speak to his nation. Think about when our president speaks to the nation. If we are about to take military action or anything else, this was a very sobering speech for the Russian people, and what he laid out escalated this situation. He kept saying things like Ukraine is not just a neighbor, it is an inherent part of our history, our culture, our spiritual space. We cannot help but react to what Ukraine is doing. It is like a knife at our throat. He talks about NATO. He talks about the U.S. To me, this message was, if we lose Ukraine, we lose our empire. And the speech was indeed rambling, but the message was the same over and over and over. And as you said, David, they have 150,000 troops at least on all three sides of this country in a position that are refueled. The weapons are uploaded. They are ready to attack if Vladimir Putin gives the final say. We've already heard our president, President Biden, say he thinks Vladimir Putin has made a decision to invade. Now, whether this is a speech to his nation to say we don't have to invade the whole country, or whether it's going forward, I think most officials believe that an invasion is coming, David.
Martha, stick with me here, because I want to underscore a point you just made there with Vladimir Putin and the language he used when it came to Ukraine. He said, if we lose Ukraine. He also talked about the leadership, the president of Ukraine, essentially comparing Ukraine and the leadership there to being a puppet for the U.S., for the West. He talked about the Russian language not being used in Kyiv anymore, a sort of cleanse of the culture. There certainly was not a recognition of independence and sovereignty that the West is trying to protect for Ukraine.
None whatsoever, David, none at all. And that was the message. Look what he's doing to our Russia. Look what the United States is doing to our Russia. Look what NATO is doing to our Russia. Look what President Zelensky from the Ukraine is doing to us. They are the threat. We are not the threat. That is Putin's message from the beginning, but he laid it out in very, very stark terms.
Martha Raddatz with us from Ukraine. Martha, thank you again. Vladimir Putin telling the Russian people just moments ago the decision has been made now. His decision to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, of course, two significant parts of the Donbass region, as independent. He said he warned the Ukrainians to end the hostilities, otherwise warning that there could be Russian action to follow. Of course, Western leaders fear that what we've been watching with the amassing of the troops along the eastern border with Ukraine could mean that he would possibly send in those troops to help secure that independence. You're looking at that small little area there that's surrounded in yellow lines there. That's the Donbass region, two significant areas of that. Vladimir Putin declaring as independent from Ukraine. Of course, these developments are moving quickly. As soon as we learn more from the Biden administration, the White House, about whether or not sanctions will be implemented immediately, we'll come back on the air and let you know. In the meantime, our coverage continues. ABC News Live, abcnews.com, and I'll be back with the entire team you just saw here on World News Tonight. I'm David Muir in New York. Good day.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.